the economy of the New South was based on industry, that is manufacturing, on extractives, and on agriculture. This added only manufacturing to the older arrangement of things, though it did tend to stand agriculture on its head as the dominant economic activity of the area. That is, whereas agriculture had been thoroughly dominant in the antebellum economy of the South, then it was still dominant, but it was not quite as dominant as it had been. So let's explore now the structure of the economy of the New South, recognizing that we're talking about an economy of an area trying to dig itself out of a war and out of a loss of a major economic resource, that is slavery. Commensurate with our discussion of the New South Creed, let's begin with the newest arm of the Southern economy in the post-Civil War era, and that is manufacturing. Probably the most significant component of manufacturing was the part that plays second fiddle, and that is textile manufacturing. Textile manufacturing increased the number of mills from 161 in 1869 to 400 in 1909. The number of mill hands increased by 500% in that same 50-year period. Cotton consumption in these textile manufacturing concerns increased by 800%. But it did not bring tool making with it. That is, the textile manufacturing industries of the South bought their tools from tool makers primarily in the North. If the textile manufacturing industries had brought tool making or heavier industries to the South, then they would have been much more stable and much less subject to changes in cotton price and cotton supply, or labor price and labor supply. As it was, they were a good source of income for the area, if not for the textile manufacturing workers themselves, for 50 years, 70, 75 years, but they fell when textile manufacturers began moving to even lower wage areas of the United States, but primarily out of the United States entirely. One of the interesting things that we thought we knew about the textile manufacturing industries of the South was that Northern capital came in and created the textile manufacturing industry of the South. But later research has turned up many instances in which local Southern professional elites, like lawyers and doctors who had some money set aside, began their own textile manufacturing concerns and then desperately sought to sell these things to Northern industrialists or Northern financiers in order to grow these industries or to gain a short-term profit from selling these industries, whereupon the locals would get out, the local financing would leave, and Northern financing would come in and expand these industries pretty wildly. And this is exactly what happened. Regardless of who founded any of the textile manufacturing sites, that eventually Northern capital came to dominate textile manufacturing, which meant that profits did not stay in the South necessarily outside of wages. Many times, as we'll discover in just a little while, states and localities would give textile manufacturers great tax breaks, and so except for wages, these guys were pumping almost nothing into the economy. Now, wages is a pretty good deal, but beyond that, they were moving most of their money to stockholders who lived in the North. Another great manufacturing concern, and the one that gets almost all of the press and all of the verbal play, is the pig and cast iron manufacturing industry. This was centered on a line that ran from Rome, Georgia, through Anniston and Gadsden, Alabama, to what became the Pittsburgh of the South, Birmingham, Alabama. Now, Birmingham was founded after the Civil War. It was founded in 1871 by a group of land speculators and a railroad surveyor whose job it was to locate the intersection of the Alabama-Chattanooga rail line with a rail line called the East-West Rail Line. He founded this intersection immediately adjacent to a plot of property owned by the so-called Elyton Land Company, a group of land speculators in the belt of coal and iron ore and limestone that stretched from Rome, Georgia, over to Tuscaloosa County, Alabama, in the middle of Jefferson County, Alabama. John Milner ran the tracks. He surveyed the tracks so that they would run for 1,000 yards parallel to each other, which formed the southern boundary of the land owned by the Elyton Land Company, and that was the foundation of Birmingham, Alabama. Founded in 1861, it almost died in 1871. It almost died in 1873 because of a cholera outbreak. But by the 1880s was not only back on its feet, but was expanding so rapidly that people came to call it not only the Pittsburgh of the South because of the iron that it was producing, but also the Magic City because it had grown so rapidly. It was known for making pig iron, and you can see in the image to the lower left, the making of pig iron. Pigs of iron are those things in that image to the right of the center. That is iron flowing out of a furnace into a trough that looked to the farm hands who had become ironmen like a sow suckling piglets. And so they called this pig iron. Each of those ingots of pig iron weighs about 75 pounds. Pig iron was used to make cast iron pipe and heavy equipment, heavy consumer durable equipment like stoves. Cast iron pipe could range anywhere in diameter from 3-inch water mains up to 50-inch storm sewer pipes. And it was during this era of the Gilded Age, the post-Civil War era, when manufacturing cities boomed across the face of the United States, when money was concentrated pretty heavily in the hands of people who could afford it, that cities then bought cast iron pipe to sanitize their cities, to get rid of outhouses and to lay in public sewer systems. In fact, if it hadn't been for public sewer systems, the cast iron pipe industry would never have gone anywhere. Also, the cousin of the sewer system is the water purification system and the public water works systems, and many cities installed both of these, bring clean water in and pump effluvia out. Another great use for cast iron pipe was in the building of railroads. And in fact, railroads were the largest users of iron product, not just for laying track, though that was the heaviest use, but also for building rail cars. And in fact, the rail system spawned a car building industry in northern Alabama as well as other places throughout the United States. Um, there were other consumer industries that came along. There was cigarette making after the development of the cigarette making machine that you see to the lower right. Here, this was a ready-made machine. That is, you didn't roll your own anymore. You bought packets of cigarettes. And there was a cigar making industry centered on Ybor City near Tampa in Florida. In fact, northern Florida was well known for growing what they called shade tobacco. This was tobacco grown under gauze shade, worked under huge tents of gauze that protected the tobacco from the direct penetrating rays of the sun. And this tobacco was prized for the nice shape of its leaf and the sturdiness of its leaf that could be used as the wrapper out on the outside of cigars. The cigarette making industry was what the Duke brothers founded American Tobacco upon, and they were wealthy enough that they could eventually endow a university named after them in North Carolina, that is Duke University. Outside of manufacturing, we see the continuation of extractive industries. Now, this is not agriculture. This is the taking of natural resources and converting them into higher value goods, but not complete manufacturing of these goods. And the two most obvious of these was the coal and iron industries and the lumber and naval store industries. Extractives in iron making included the coal industry, in which coal miners dug the coal out of the ground and then coke ovens frequently turned it into coke, which would burn hotter than the charcoal because it was all the impurities were burned out of it. Iron ore mining is another extractive that was based or that became the basis of the iron industry. And limestone quarrying is that third component of the iron making industry that was actually extractive. So you have coal mining, iron ore mining, and limestone mining or quarrying. As you might say, these are the three great ingredients that go into making iron. Charcoal for burning, iron ore for extracting the metal out of and making the basis of iron, obviously, but limestone for what's called flux. The reason that Pittsburgh became an iron making center, the reason that Birmingham, Rome, Chattanooga became a stretch of iron making in the United States is because in both of these great areas, coal, iron ore, and limestone sit in close proximity. In fact, nowhere else in the world do these three ingredients of iron making sit closer to one another in larger quantities than in the stretch from Anniston, Alabama in the east through Birmingham to Tuscaloosa in the west. The naval stores industry and the lumber industry stretched through the piney woods of North Carolina, hence Tar Heel, through the pine barrens of Georgia, North Florida, Alabama, across into Mississippi. At first, the naval stores industry would take the resin from the pine trees and turn it into either pine tar or turpentine, both of which had multiple uses. Then as the trees began to die, the turpentiners would move on. They would cook they would not only take the pine tar, the pine resin, but then they would cook it in vats that you could smell for miles around. It was a tremendous industry of great importance for a number of years in the upper deep South. Then the lumberers would move in and take the trees for the building of houses primarily. This was the era in which Americans switched from cabins, from log cabins and that kind of housing and solid brick housing to frame housing. And building thousands and thousands of frame houses required billions of feet of lumber, which could be taken from these pine trees and these great piney woods. So you see here on the illustration on the left, you see turpentiners or tappers of some sort taking the pine resin. To the right, you see, in the upper right, you see a group of sawyers who, and it's about 1925, working the piney woods for lumber. And then below that, you see a mine, either a coal mine or an iron ore mine, representing these extractive industries. But the king of it all was still agriculture, and the king of agriculture was cotton. Between 1866 and 1900, cotton acreage across the South increased by 328%, and the cotton lands became more productive. Yields increased by 481%, almost 100% more than the acreage increased. Nevertheless, prices fell between 1870 and 1900 by about 50%. And this, in a cash-strapped area like the South, had the perverse effect of forcing farmers to grow more cotton. The reason prices fell was because there was a glut on the market during the American Civil War. The British textile industry, which was the great consumer of American cotton, had to find other suppliers, and so they looked to Argentina, to India, and to Egypt to supply their cotton. When American cotton exports came back online in 1869, there was a little bit of a blip in cotton prices, but suddenly everyone realized that there was a glut on the market. And so for the next 30 years, cotton prices fell by half. And again, this led American cotton farmers to grow more and more and more cotton because they were too poor to take a chance on diversifying. Plus, the cotton economy was vastly different. It was organized in a vastly different way in the New South than it had been in the Old South. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. There were places that diversified. We see rice, mostly dry land rice, being grown in Georgia and South Carolina. Yields increased by about 333%, 1870 to 1900. Tobacco increased by almost 300%, particularly in North Carolina, where that particular kind of tobacco, bright, was very good for making cigarettes. And like I said before, in Northwest Florida, where shade-grown tobacco became the basis of cigar making. You see a farm family in the lower right. You see a tobacco family, the Zells, in the lower left, and you see a cotton boll in the upper right. In addition to agriculture, we find an expanse of food gathering. Oysters became a major industry, particularly in North Florida and in Louisiana. We see the advent of truck farming, that is vegetable plots for city dwellers. And we see the emergence of a feed industry in areas that wanted to feed off their cattle. In many cases, farmers switched from cotton agriculture, this is particularly in the 20th century, switched from cotton agriculture to beef raising. And so they needed corn to fatten off their beef before sale to market. And this spawned its own agricultural industry. Well, during the period of, say, 1870, and after our period begins in 1877 into the early 1900s, and in fact in the Deep South into the late 1900s, how was agriculture organized? This is an important question. This map shows in the darkest area, the so-called Black Belt that ran from Virginia into far, far eastern Texas. And this was an area of black, very rich soil, underground or underlay with a layer of chalk about 3 feet down below the subsurface of the soil. In Alabama and in Mississippi, that is area 4 on this map, area IV on this map, that substrata, excuse me, not substrata, but that land mass is really prairie land. It's flat, it's easily farmed, it's inundated with water, and it's absolutely perfect for cotton farming. Well, after the Civil War, many of the old plantation owners who had not ever been divested of their plantations returned to their plantations. Many times new owners had bought out the old owners, or the lands had been abandoned, but instead of being broken up and given to yeoman farmers, they were maintained and sold to new investors who then reorganized the plantations. Many plantations were reestablished in the Black Belt as a form of agribusiness. And instead of actively farming the land, many times these plantation owners were landlords. That is, they made money off of renting the land to others. They did not necessarily actively farm. Now, this does not mean that every plantation owner did not farm. Many did farm directly, but we see fewer direct farmers among plantation owners in the post-bellum period, and we see more rentiers, people who would rent out their plantation lands. Now, of course, plantation farming was not the only mechanism of farming in the South. It had never been the only mechanism of farming in the South, and in fact constituted a minority of farmers in the Old South and the New South. Most farmers in the Old South and the New South were subsistence farmers. That is, they had small plots by which they fed their family, and they might have had a small amount that they could trade on the market, that is, at their local little town. They didn't really engage in the market economy. There was another group who did engage in the market economy. They are generally referred to as yeoman farmers. They grew what they needed to some extent, but they also grew cash crops. They were just small farmers who worked their own land, or who hired, or who worked their land in conjunction with hiring people to work with them, hiring labor to work with them. But the most characteristic, even though it was not the majority of farmers, the most characteristic, the thing that we remember most are these plantations. Whereas the plantations had been gang farmed with gangs of slaves, except in the low country of Georgia and the low country of South Carolina, where task farming was the way these things were organized. Then once slavery was abolished, it was impossible because of the way that the use of gang farming symbolized slavery, to reinstitute that mechanism. That is, a plantation owner could not, was simply unable, because no one would work this way, to rebuild gangs of agricultural proletarians who would then go out and work as a unit on a farm. Know what most poor folks in the postbellum South wanted, what most African Americans wanted, was a place to call their own, quote unquote, and whether they got that by ownership or by renting did not matter to them. But renting, it was recognized as a desirable thing to have your own place, even if there were restrictions on it. But in a low cash economy like the postbellum South was for so many years, how could this occur? What was the mechanism by which it could take place? How could they arrange it? Well, they arranged it through tenancy. We still see tenancy today. I live in an agricultural area. In fact, as I make this lecture, I'm not only looking at my computer screen, I'm looking at the window just beyond my computer screen, and I'm looking at, across a parking lot, at a field planted now in peanuts that will be planted later in cotton, just about 120 yards in front of me. That field is owned by Troy University, and we rent it to a local farmer or two local farmers. And we have a lot of land around this, around the Dothan campus. And we rent our fields to local farmers who then farm as they care to farm and pay us cash for the rent of the land. Well, in a low cash economy like the South of the postbellum era into the post-World War II era, we find sharecropping as one significant mechanism by which cash poor but labor rich people could secure their own facility, could secure their own competence, could secure their own plot of land and small house. Sometimes they paid cash rent, but in many cases they sharecropped. And that was a situation in which the cashless farmer offered to work a plot of land usually owned by a plantation owner for part of the crop. And instead of them dividing the actual crop, they would talk about the price of cotton and the cash rent that the crop was supposed to bring and work out an annual contract based on that. But the land was not the only thing that a sharecropper needed. They also needed credit from what became known as a furnishing merchant. That is, someone who gave seed and supplies in exchange for a promise of payment later, and that payment would come from selling the cotton. So let's back up. Plantation owners ultimately ended up breaking up. Most plantation owners broke up their plantations into small holdings. They continued to own the land, but they rented the land to sharecroppers, white and black, either for a cash rent or for some kind of annual deal, a contract that provided for the payment of part of the crop as rent for the land. These sharecropping farmers, again cash poor, would also make deals with a furnishing merchant. Frequently, the landowner was the furnishing merchant. Frequently, a relative of the landowner was the local storekeeper and furnishing merchant. And where this system had begun as a way by which plantation owners could get their land worked, and a way by which recently freed slaves could maintain themselves without the close supervision that they had been used to as slaves. They could feel freer. Where it had become a system to provide that, within a few years it devolved into a system by which to keep labor uneducated and on the farm and in debt peonage. In fact, the American South began developing a peasant system, almost a serf-like system of cotton farming and sharecropping. And sharecropping ultimately gained a reputation as not only a bad system, but an evil system. Now, how expansive was sharecropping? Let me give you one example from Alabama. By 1910, 60% of the farms in Alabama were worked by tenants. That is, sharecroppers and those who paid cash rent, and mostly sharecroppers. So this was a widespread system that lasted for a long time, and it was the prosperity, the system of payments brought about under the New Deal in the 1930s, and then the prosperity that came about after the Second World War that ultimately led to the conversion of sharecropping into cash rentals and the eradication of the crop lien and the furnishing merchant. Remember too that this crop lien was the way that the furnishing merchant and the plantation owner got paid. They would be able to demand in law payment from the sharecropper, regardless of how much the sharecropper actually brought in. Frequently, and this is the real evil of the tenancy and the crop lien system, the furnishing merchant kept the books. They were not obliged by law to show those books to the credit to the debtor, that is, to the sharecropper, and so they could charge what they wanted. They could say that the cropper owed whatever they wanted to say the cropper owed, and they had the right to require the cropper to stay on the land until the debt was paid. Frequently, croppers stayed in debt their entire lives because of this crop lien system. And that was the really evil component of the sharecropping system, was this inability of croppers to get what they thought was a fair deal and to get out from under their debt peonage. With that, we'll end this discussion of the economy of the New South. And thank you very much.